Hello, FrightFest. Well, this is very strange. I'm Rosie Fletcher from Den of Geek. I'm the UK editor of Den of Geek, and welcome to this very special horror and lockdown panel. Now, what I was going to say is this is live. And because this is live and I'm a bit of a dinosaur, things like what just happened a moment ago where the YouTube was streaming into my ears and I could hear my own voice might happen again. So I ask you to be patient and forgive me. So just very quickly before I introduce my amazing guest, this panel is going to last 90 minutes. But there'll be time, maybe about 20 minutes at the end for questions. So you can submit questions either through, so you might be able to do it via Eventive, have a go. You can definitely do it on the YouTube stream. And you could also at me on Twitter. So I'm at Rosie Fletcher. And if you hashtag horror in lockdown, I'll be able to pick up questions and comments from there. So I think that's about it for my terrible housekeeping. So now let me introduce my amazing guest. Let me begin with the amazing Anna Bogetskaya. She's a horror expert, a writer, a podcaster, creative producer, festival director of the Underwire Festival, and co-founder of The Final Girls. So, Anna, where are you? There you are. Welcome.
Hi.
And next,
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for coming. So next up, we have the extraordinary Rose Glass, who's the director of St. Maud, which is one of my favourite films of the year. It played the festival circuit to great acclaim, played FrightFest Glasgow, and was originally due to be released in spring, but is now heading to cinemas this October. So, Rose, let me say hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Okay, I'd also like to welcome the unstoppable Rob Savage, director of Lockdown Sensation Host. It's a genuinely brilliant horror movie shot remotely during lockdown, which you can watch on Shudder. And I also understand it's going to be getting some other releases, but Rob can tell you about that. But it's undoubtedly going to be one of the defining movies of 2020. Hello, Rob.
Hey.
Hey. And finally, the immense Paul Tremblay, one of the best horror writers working today, and certainly one of my favourite horror writers, author of A Head Full of Ghosts, Disappearance at Devil's Rock, Cabin at the End of the World, and others, and most recently Survivor Song, which was published in July and is about the outbreak of a deadly infection. So, Paul.
Thank you, Rosie.
It's my pleasure. Happy to have you.
Just so everybody knows, my candle says it's serenity and calm. I don't know if I grabbed the right one.
That's all right.
Oh, okay. That's what it says.
That's a nice thing. We've all got our candles.
We want tension and evil.
We've all got our candles in honour of Rob's movie, and I know that not all of you will have seen it, but if you have seen it, you'll get it. Hoping no spooky goings on will transpire during this panel.
No promises.
Well, so first of all, I wanted to talk to you about FrightFest and whether any of you guys have had a chance to watch any of the programme and how you sort of found the missing element of cinema and in lockdown. And I know, Paul, that actually option wouldn't have been open to you because it's UK only, but right. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you're doing to scratch the cinema itch. Anyone watch any FrightFest?
I haven't, no, but I have just started going back to the cinema, which is very weird and but fun. Like I just went to see Tenet, and I went to see we did a screening of The Ring the other week, and it's very weird being back around people, but it's also very nice. And no, I was saying to Rose, I still haven't seen St. Maud. I've been dying to. I got a link for St. Maud from Studio Canal, and I got about 5 minutes in. I was like, this is way too beautiful to watch on a small screen, so I'm gonna hold out for the big screen experience. I think some horror films work no matter where you watch them, but some of them they're just big screen movies.
Yeah, and I watched Host over this weekend on my laptop, and obviously that kind of just plays in. I mean, it's cool. It's kind of going to have a cinema run, but I love watching it on the screen because I was watching it by myself at first, and then like I'm at my parents' house at the moment. My mum was in the background, and she was kind of like, "Oh, who are you talking to?" And she assumed I was, kind of talking to someone there. And then she sat down and watched it with me and got really into it. But it does the sort of even though it's obviously not interactive, it sort of has the feel of being somehow more immersive in it made me think a little bit more like, I don't know, slightly immersive theatre kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I don't know, it really was great.
Well, one of the things, so I
haven't been
haven't
to the
watched
cinema yet.
Well, I have been watching a bit of FrightFest, and one of the things, and it's been great. So, by the way, congratulations, guys! It's amazing. But one of the things that I worried that I would miss is the community element of cinema, and I wondered like whether you guys would agree with that. And I mean, it's been quite good. I've got my little FrightFest family, and we've got a little group, and everyone's chatting, but it isn't the same as being sat in a cinema. And so I wondered whether you'd found that, or whether the sort of levels of community during lockdown have been a thing for you.
Horror is so much about like just feeling that everyone in the same room is having the same experience, and you can just fit. Like we played The Ring the other day, and we had about 70 people turn up, and it was this big crowd. And that amazing moment at the end where the TV turns back on, it builds up to that final set piece. The chill that went through the room is just absolutely amazing. And that's what I miss about watching horror movies with an audience, is feeling like, oh, we're all having exactly the same experience right now.
Yeah. I mean, you can feed off each other and it builds.
Yeah.
I'd completely agree with that. Like, I've been all throughout lockdown and during FrightFest Fantasia, which is also going on now. You can participate, and there's always groups. There's WhatsApp groups. You can do Netflix watch parties. You can do Zoom watch parties and all of that. But the fact is that the visceral experience and that contagious element of watching a film in the same room at the same time with people is just impossible to replicate. And I've been to the cinema once since March, and even that kind of felt completely different. So I really miss watching not just horror films in general in a cinema surrounded by people in that sort of carefree, visceral way, where it does feel like if something really scary or impactful is going on screen, it's sort of like it is a ripple effect through the audience. And that's impossible to replicate at home. Like, I watched Host by myself in my house, and it was terrifying, but I literally could not turn to anyone and grab them or be like, did you see that? Did you see the same thing that I saw in the background there? Which is a thing that I really miss about festivals.
Yeah. Do you guys have like movie? Because there's a couple of movies that I remember watching like on my laptop at home and just being so freaked the fuck out. Like the first time I watched Blair Witch, because I wasn't allowed to watch it, but I stole the VHS tape from a friend of mine and put it in when my parents were out. And watching that on my own is such a singular experience. Like, I've only seen that film once, and I probably won't watch it again because I just remember being so terrified in that moment. And I guess that's a different experience for horror films, just watching them on your own.
I'm worried maybe I'm a bit of a loser. I quite like watching films by myself, but it sort of freaks you out even more. But I remember watching the biggest, like, scary, it's not a horror film, but I remember watching Mulholland Drive for the first time on my laptop with it like right up close. Yeah. And then when the homeless guy sort of appears from around here, I literally just like, oh no, this kind of stuff for that. So it's a different kind of fear. But then, sorry, Paul, I interrupt you, but the sort of communal thing is definitely a lot more like fun, and I think it sort of suits some. I don't know, like, because watching Host, even though it wasn't in a crowd, like I was watching it with my mum, but just having like one other person, and I enjoy the laughter that comes after scares, and there's like couple as well. But like and I don't think you get the laughter quite the same when you do it by yourself, unless you're like laughing at yourself, which I do sometimes. But you know, first there's the sort of moment of horror, and then everyone's laughing at everybody in the cinema making good noise. So it's sort of, that's an extra kind of level of enjoyment that I don't think you quite get on your own. But if it's like something really sort of like dark and serious and messed up, I'm quite happy to watch it by myself. Yeah.
I was just going to add that I'm definitely a combo of Rose and Rob. I've found that for some movies, I've really enjoyed the laptop now that I've been in quarantine, to the point where I recently saw Noroi the Curse for the first time on my laptop. Oh yeah. And I was getting so freaked out, like I went into the TV, my wife was watching television, so I went and sat next to her on the couch just so I could be a little bit safer watching this movie. And at one point she happened to look at the screen. She's like, what the hell are you watching? I'm like, I know. It's funny in the US, and this might be a reflection of me going to suburban cinemas more than big city cinemas, but like my experience with seeing horror movies, before quarantine, with sort of I'll call it the general populace, as opposed to like a festival setting, was miserable. Like I wanted to stab people in the theater. They ruined, just seeing it with people like you don't know what they're in for. Like I think the last movie I saw in a theater was The Lighthouse. Just people talking, for the first hour. It's like, sure. Oh.
Like, what's this?
But, yeah, no, exactly. And the same thing happened with, my brother and I tend to go if we're local, and he's a big horror fan. So, I mean, I do miss not going with him, but I don't miss being angry at moviegoers. Yeah. I will say, though, one of the few opportunities I've had to go to a festival, the Telluride Horror Show, I went in 2018. And that was like, I've never experienced anything like that, because everyone knew what they were doing in the theater. Yeah. They were quiet when they were supposed to be. They laughed when they were supposed to. They reacted when they were supposed to. And yes, that was like a wonderful experience that, I would love more of. I just don't get enough of, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
American audiences can be great. Like I went to see, last time I was in LA, I went to see, what is it, Annabelle Comes Home or whatever. And like those kind of like fun roller coaster horrors are super fun, where everyone's just like yelling at the screen and throwing in.
Yeah.
I think The Lighthouse, I think I probably would have wanted to stab people as well.
I think there is something that Paul mentioned that is important, is that kind of that difference of what the setting is. Because if you're at a horror festival, like you mentioned, everybody knows what they're there for, and they're in for the ride, and they're reacting, and you're kind of there for the reactions as well, not just to watch the movie by itself. So sometimes whenever I watch horror films that I really, really loved, alone or with a handful of other journalists at press screenings or whatnot, the experience is always so quite stale, even if the movie is incredible, because you're controlling your own reactions, and you're in a really controlled environment. Whether it's at a festival, especially at festivals like FrightFest or very specific genre spaces, you can just, part of the experience is the audience's reaction as well. You're there for that too, for that sense of community.
Yeah, festival audiences are definitely more vocal. I think when Maud had its premiere, we were doing Midnight Madness, and they had a benefit of everyone being a bit sort of drunk by that point as well, which helps massively. So just loud reactions. Like, oh, thank God.
As Rob mentioned, Rose, so I was lucky enough to see St. Maud in a cinema at a press screening, because you guys were all geared up to come out, and it is an incredibly cinematic film. But obviously, that must be quite frustrating for you to have to wait. Like, was there any discussion about releasing it on video on demand, or is that just not something that you'd ever wanted to consider?
I mean, it's not up to me at the end of the day, so I'm kind of like, I've abstained. I don't get to decide much. I mean, no, not really. I think we're quite, we're really lucky having Studio Canal and A24 sort of putting it out in different places. They're both pretty keen on still doing it in the cinema, so it is definitely here. Still don't quite know what's happening in America. So I'm hoping they'll tell us any day. Yeah, exactly. Because at one point, because we were literally like 4 days from getting on a plane and going out there and doing the whole thing. So, and then that stopped. And then at one point we were meant to be released in July, like when cinemas opened. I think it was going to be like Us and Unhinged or something. And I was like, yes. And then they pulled that out. But I don't know. I'll believe it when it happens. Now I'm kind of see what happens. But yeah, I can't wait. I feel really lucky to have done it in the cinema, like doing the festival run, and all the stuff that we're talking about, getting these kind of vocal reactions, getting a chance to do that at least sort of in festivals and see the film with an audience is so great. Like there's been, I've got quite a few friends who sort of have films, their festival premieres have now sort of been online and stuff, which is pretty tough. But yeah, weird times.
And so I wanted to ask, like, because this is your feature debut, Rose, and like what it kind of means to or how important is it, do you think, to get a theatrical release when it's your first film? Do you think that your movie wouldn't have had as much traction had you not had a chance to have those kind of theatrical screenings?
Well, I mean, yeah, obviously, it's like, I think probably any filmmaker who sort of goes into it, you kind of fantasize about you want it to be in cinemas. So there's definitely some sort of like romantic thing about that. And, by the time it gets to a point, if you're lucky enough to have like a distributor that's putting it in cinemas and you're getting a theatrical release, that just gives things a slight more scale, I guess. Maybe more people will see it. And yeah, maybe I'm a snob or something, but I, love seeing stuff on the big screen. And obviously I'm kind of like, I'm so glad Rob is watching it in the cinema and didn't watch it on his laptop link, but stuff like that. So I mean, there's something definitely sort of romantic about it. I don't know how much that's gonna change now gradually. People have to just get more, because I don't know, because at first when people started having discussions about a lot of films coming out on VOD during lockdown, and it was kind of, well, maybe we'll end up doing that. I think at first I had like a day or two where I was like, oh no, that would be terrible. And then I don't know, you're kind of like, well, if everyone's doing that, and if that's just how cinema is ending up changing. And to be fair, probably there's a fair amount of people who there might be films that they wouldn't go and see at the cinema, but if it's there and they can watch it on VOD at home, they might take a bit more risk. So weirdly, you might end up having, more people seeing it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure on talking about this because I'm kind of learning all this as I go along. So I'm kind of like, yes. good. Just as long as people watch it somehow, that would be good.
And like Rob, yours is almost the opposite journey, where you produce this amazing film in like 12 weeks, and now you're actually going to get a theatrical. I've just learned, which is amazing.
Yeah. And I think it's not going to feel real. Like it's so weird because I'm, I pretty much haven't left my house since I made Host, so it doesn't feel like really much has changed. I'm just on Twitter a lot more, and it's really bizarre to think that people are actually watching the movie. And I think we've got our first screening next Friday at the BFI, and I think when I can sit at the back row and like watch people jump and watch it with an audience, I think it's going to kind of sink in that it's a real thing that's happened.
Yeah,
it's quite surreal, like releasing it. But I think we just hit at the right time, that it managed to take off despite being something that was on a streaming platform and that was on a horror specific streaming platform. And I think that there are different avenues to getting eyes on your movie, but it's not always having to do the festival circuit. But that until Host, that would have been, in my mind, that would have been the only way. But obviously there's different ways around it.
Yeah. And Anna, you said that you've been to the cinema?
I have once.
What did you see?
I went to see Tenet.
What do you reckon?
What do you think?
I went to see Tenet.
How was it?
I'd rather. Okay. I'll talk about the cinema experience as opposed to the movie.
Opinion.
It was very strange. I've never felt such paranoia going into an enclosed space, especially the space where I feel my best, which is a cinema with a big screen. And I went to my local indie. Didn't want to go to a chain. And there was maybe a handful of people, maybe 10 people in the screen. Everything was extremely sanitized, very well controlled. So absolute kudos to the cinema that kind of how they're managing it. But it felt weird. It felt very strange. It completely did not feel like this cinema experience, any other cinema experience that I had. It just felt, I was hyper conscious of my surroundings, which kind of goes in opposition to what a cinema experience gives you, which is that you lose yourself in the screen, you lose yourself in this collective experience and the feelings that the audience is sharing with you. And now I was very aware of the guy who was next to me and whether he was going to try to kind of cross the same road that we were in after he came back from the bathroom, or whether he was way too close and needed to move one seat over. I was very aware, like looking around to see if everybody was still wearing their masks. I was looking to see kind of how people moved around, how they were behaving. So it really, I could never fully lose myself in the experience. And I don't know, maybe it was because it was the first time. Maybe it was because it was Tenet. But also, I think that might be a whole process for us kind of going forward.
Yeah. Essentially, I saw it too. But I mean, mine was a press screening, so it was slightly artificial. Paul, I wanted to ask you about the book world, because I know that StokerCon, which I believe you were supposed to be a guest of honor at, was postponed. I think Chimera was cancelled. Fantasy World Con was cancelled. So, like, I mean, what impact has it had on the sort of literary community, the lockdown?
Oh yeah, I mean, so obviously no conventions. It's just even like with the book out in early July, usually you do live events at bookstores, and none of those. It's all been sort of these Zoom events. Which are fun, but not, obviously not quite the same. So in terms of like the rest of the effect, I'm not sure. I mean, it's weird. I don't know. Well, listening to Anna talk about like how one of her favorite spaces is like made her, paranoid, and and I've grown to really like going to conventions, and I have so many friends, both in the UK and America. But I can feel myself becoming more like agoraphobic. I'm more used to just staying at home and be like, geez, I wonder if I'll be less likely to want to go out, because, I've been reminded, when I do leave, in my own head, I'm reminded, like I spent all this time away from, my wife and my kids and stuff like that. So I don't know. It's, I mean, don't get me wrong. I definitely miss seeing all my best friends, but if and when the time comes where, big crowds get to go, short of a vaccine that shows up where you feel like super confident, it's going to feel weird and paranoid. I mean, I'm still a high school teacher as well, and I'm supposed to head back to school tomorrow for meetings this week, and it's really gonna be like the first time I'm gonna be around people, and I'm not really looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Goodness.
Wow.
So I wanted to talk about our relationship with horror particularly. So like all of you are kind of experts in the field, but do you think the stories that we want to be told or the stories that we want to watch or read because we are living in an actual live horror movie are different? I mean, I'd be interested to hear any of your have your viewing habits changed? Have your tastes changed?
I mean, when we chatted before about Host, Rosie, I was saying to you that like at the start of lockdown, I'd made a big pile of all the DVDs that I was going to watch that I'd been putting off, my Tarkovsky and my Bergman and all that kind of, and I ended up just watching all the Halloween movies again. I watched Halloween 4, 5, 6, and like, I don't know, it felt like it was the kind of slightly trashier, switch your brain off movies that I lent toward. Not saying that horror is that, but that was the kind of particular kind of horror that I was leaning towards. It's just, I don't know, anything to turn my mind off during all this.
Yeah, I think the first film I watched when the lockdown happened properly, like my flatmates, we all just sat and watched Magic Mike, which I'd never seen before. Brilliant.
Great movie.
This is an amazing movie.
Have you seen the second one? The second
no,
one.
I haven't.
Genuinely,
the second is a masterpiece.
It really is.
The second one's so funny.
It really is.
It's just such nonsense.
I'm kind of the same as Rob, to be honest. I just feel like I'm a bit of a shit cinephile. Like I was kind of thinking, yes, I have all this time to watch all of the things on this very long list that I should have done. And yeah, it was like Magic Mike and lots of like old episodes of like Smack the Pony, which we don't have in America, and like I don't know, I think I've started to veer towards some like sort of weirder stuff. I was like rewatching like Visitor Q and Taxidermy and things like that, just in a way to kind of that. But if it was one or the other, it was kind of just rewatching old familiar TV things or something that's just kind of quite sort of the people you're asking, we're all probably going to be attracted to that. I don't know if most other people.
Do you get this thing, Rose, where you don't like? I find that when I'm at home, I don't want to watch movies that are too good because it stresses me out. Like,
I should be making one.
Like, fuck, I'll never be as good as that. Why am I watching? In a cinema, I can kind of switch that off. But like at home, I just end up pacing around my flat, being miserable.
No, I wasn't. No, didn't think about it that much, but now I probably will. I'm like, I should have played this.
That's why I turned St. Maud off. It's giving me stress.
Fuck that.
That'd be stupid. Shit, you don't like it.
But on that, I mean, all of you guys were working in some capacity.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say that actually, the whole rewatching syndrome seemed very familiar. I went through this myself in lockdown. I also thought, oh my god, yes, all the unwatched Blu-rays, all of the links that I've got that I haven't got to, I'm gonna get on top of all of the films that I just haven't completed. I'm gonna pick all of the directors and go through all of their filmography, and then I just couldn't focus on any of it.
I think it kind of tapped into this feeling of like, particularly at the beginning, it's probably loads of people felt that way. You know, there was this, suddenly everyone has so much time on their hands and there's this pressure to like, I must be doing something and making use of it. So obviously we're working in the arts. It's kind of like, okay, we must, I don't know. I think in the end it was just, ended up just lounging around and
no, when
crises like everyone else.
when we first went into lockdown, it coincided with a 2-week spring break from school. And you know what I watched during those 2 weeks were MythBuster reruns, Animal Planet shows about fluffy animals at zoos. Honestly, and one of my refuges is trying reading, and I had a really hard time reading. And what helped break me out of it was rereading a favorite. When you're talking about revisiting favorite movies, I reread a Peter Straub novel, which is not light material. Peter Straub's The Throat, it's like this 700-page serial killer novel essentially.
Nice light.
But it just helped. I don't know. It helped me get back a piece of me. And so like otherwise, like I've definitely been watching horror movies. I do, even though I wrote one, sort of been avoiding like anything that's like post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic or pre-apocalyptic. So I understand, but I also understand people who feel like, oh, they're going to watch all that stuff.
Do you watch?
That's just my own personal reflection.
Do you watch horror movies to get inspiration for your book? Because like whenever I'm making something, I just watch a bunch of horror movies and basically steal a bunch of stuff from them. I mean, do you watch?
Do you do that, Paul?
Yeah.
It depends on the story, but when I wrote A Head Full of Ghosts, absolutely. I mean, A Head Full of Ghosts. Once I knew that it was a possession story, and I wasn't going to avoid the William Peter Blatty sized elephant in the room, that gave me permission to riff on everything I loved and didn't like about horror. So yeah, for that book in particular, I watched everything that I could that was sort of close to it. Although with Survivor Song, even though it's sort of, we'll call it zombie adjacent, I don't know how Rosie would describe it, but I actually did the opposite. I avoided watching things that were sort of close to it, but it was all there. Like, it was all there to reference and riff on. So I didn't feel like I needed to rewatch any of those movies at the time.
And with Survivor Song, it's particularly interesting because it's zombie adjacent, but I don't really think of it as a zombie novel. I think of it as an infection novel, certainly, and a bit of a kind of a road movie type thing. But it's not so much. So you said you weren't really watching a load of zombie films or watching a load of infection things, but your kind of sort of starting point, I remember you telling me, was actually a real thing. It was your sister's experience of a pandemic, which is why that book is so incredibly prescient, like maybe more than anything else I've read. So was that something that you found quite difficult to cope with when lockdown began?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the original what if for the book, which I can't say because it sort of spoils the story, but it was like, okay, I'm going to, riff on the zombie thing or try to make it as realistic as possible. And I'll freely admit that I hate doing research. I'm terrible at it.
It's so boring.
So, I mean, that sort of like helped shape the story. It's like, I'm not going to tell like this sprawling 1,000 characters, zombie pandemic story. I wanted to focus in really on two friends for over 4 to 6 hours. So anyway, the short of it was I needed to figure out what a local hospital, not like the national government, reaction to something like this would be. And my sister, who's only a year younger than me, or, as we joke, Irish twins, she's 11 months younger than me. She's a nurse at one of the biggest hospitals in Boston. And, so like she got me sort of what their plan would be. And it just so happened that in 2014, in Africa, the Ebola outbreak was much more severe and deadly. In the US, we had a few patients, including some nurses in Dallas, I believe, getting sick. But my sister's hospital was going to be, if we started having a run of Ebola patients, they were gonna have to obviously, treat them. And the first communications from the hospital to the nurses wasn't all that confidence filling, shall we say. It talked about like them not having hazmats or proper PPE, which was the first time I'd ever heard that acronym before. And I remember vividly taking like this text exchange that my sister had between her and her coworkers. And I remember rewriting that and going, oh, like they mentioned PPE, how I might have to like describe that a couple times just to make sure people understand what that is. And then, fast forward, 6 months after the book is released, and, it's totally unnecessary to have to explain that. So, my sister, made it through the big surge that we had in Boston, but, she lives in fear of the next one.
I mean,
so if I'm being faithful, so were you sort of finishing writing it when all of the COVID stuff kicked off, or had you finished it already? Like, did you go back and sort of revisit any stuff or anything?
No.
You're just like, it's done now.
I turned in the final edits to my publisher in late October of 2019, and they had printed like the first review copies in late December. So no, there was no, and I wouldn't have wanted to have gone back.
Yeah. I mean, without having read the book, and I have read, but that must have felt quite surreal, like added little layer of surrealness for you when all this started happening. I don't know, like forcing.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've had people say, "Oh, like you horror folk, like you must have been ready for this." Like this is like some sort of fun. Like, no, I was like in a 2-week metaphorical fetal position. I would be the worst in a zombie apocalypse. There were so many levels of weirdness for everybody, but just to have this book come out, and like I remember the first interview I did for Rolling Stone, and it appeared online in April. It came off as like I was apologizing. It was a sort of a dour interview. Even the interviewee, I felt bad because she read it in the first weeks of lockdown, and she was dour, I was dour, to the point where my US editors like called me up. He was like, "Hey, stop apologizing for the book. It's not your fault."
Trigger warnings.
Yeah.
I think we did the second interview after that, and I think your publicist was very insistent that you weren't apologetic when we spoke, which you weren't. You were a delight.
Right.
So it's interesting that you mention that horror people are supposed to be prepared. And I raise this because there was a study that was published quite recently, this is the title of it. It's study pandemic practice, horror fans and morbidly curious individuals are more psychologically resilient during the COVID-19 pandemic. So what do you think? Discuss. Do you think that because you guys are horror fans, you are more resilient?
Doesn't feel that way. I find.
Yeah, you go. You go.
No. I mean, this isn't hugely sensitive, but I find like the thing that, having watched so many apocalypse movies, I find myself having to remind myself that I'm not walking through a movie when you're seeing people in masks and you're going into the shop and people are in hazmat suits. Or I feel slightly at a distance from it. I keep having to pinch myself and remember how real it is, because so much of it is iconography from horror movies that have just become.
I wonder if that's, because I don't know about you, but I was freaked out by, or sort of slightly amazed by how quickly all of that stuff felt normal. Like how quickly it felt normal to be out and about and sort of queuing to get into the supermarkets and sort of people stop by and stuff. And I wonder if it's because on some level we've sort of seen these things in cinema before. Either that or humans just adapt quickly. But I don't know. For me, I thought it was
so used to it. It's always like the place that we're in now is always the pre-credit sequence before things go really bad. It's always
there was that thing that wasn't like Contagion became like the highest streaming whatever in the beginning of lockdown. I have to confess I hadn't seen it before, and I was watching it, and I only watched about halfway through. I watched up until the first half was great because it's like, oh, this is happening now, and then like shit started to get really horrible. I was like, oh, I think I'll turn this off now. I get the idea. We're living it now.
You should watch Contagion, the Hollywood version with Dustin Hoffman from the 90s. It's like
Outbreak.
Outbreak, not Contagion. Yeah, Outbreak. It's the kind of the like.
Oh yeah, I know the one you mean. I haven't seen it.
It's so fucking stupid. I love it. It's like
someone with a monkey, or is it?
Yeah, and I think they saved the day by blowing up the virus in a helicopter or something like that.
Yeah, it's quite satisfying though. I thought maybe the horror fans, the thing you're talking about, right, like horror fans sort of adapting to it better. I don't know if it's connected. I hadn't thought of that. I mean, to be honest, I like horror, but I don't think myself as like a massive horror nerd or anything or expert. But I got the impression from the people around me that I know that generally people who are more anxious or kind of like in normal life before all this happens, who are kind of like anxious or depressed kind of individuals, which maybe taps into morbid curiosity slightly as well. They tend to lean that way. We tended to sort of seem to be a bit calmer. It was like, oh, everybody's worried now about everything and nobody can sleep well. It's like, I know how to deal with being anxious. This will be fine. Whereas other people who I think who I knew who were just much more kind of get on with things happily, it was more of a weird mental state to be in, I guess. So I don't know.
Yeah,
used to spend
I completely agree. I think
by yourself inside going.
I think it's the anxiety. It's people who are more used to living with in a constant state of anxiety that are kind of reacted weirdly more calmly to a literal horror movie that's happening around us. I would say though that one of the things that now that I think about it in retrospect, that even about myself or about friends of mine who are horror nerds or horror fans that reacted quite calmly to the pandemic is actually that stage of people going mental in shops and kind of bulk buying everything. And one of the kind of the very horrific images was going into my local supermarket and just every single shelf being empty and people just grabbing stuff, literally climbing up the stalls and the shelves, trying to grab the last of the Dettol wipes or, just random shit that they found on shelves because the paranoia had set in.
But what you reckon?
So intensely.
But you reckon those people were the ones who were the horror fans?
No, actually the opposite. The horror fans had already pre-stocked everything.
Actually, I do remember.
I am ready for the
air raid
apocalypse.
shelter in the back anyway.
I do remember that. That was like the week before lockdown. I remember going into my big like local Sainsbury's and seeing people grabbing stuff off the shelves. I'm like, oh no, this is act one of every zombie movie. And it did feel that kind of like strange cold thing that happens in the pit of your stomach when you're watching a horrible horror movie. It did feel. And luckily, it didn't pay off, and people kind of chilled out. But it felt like we were teetering then.
Well, I would say
is it
quickly,
now the beginning of the end, or are we now all kind of like, don't say it too soon, we'll jinx it, and now it's gonna. Anyway.
We think the killer's dead, but the killer's about to wake up for one more kill.
Exactly, it's still worth stocking up on that toilet roll.
I would say briefly, is like on a personal level, as an anxious person who always dwells on worst case scenarios, and that's sort of where my fiction spirals out of. The worst case scenario just kept getting worse, so it definitely hasn't been.
Oh, really?
At least for a lot of people, yeah. But I've been sort of horrifically fascinated by the effect of of popular culture on what we're all living through now. Particularly obviously in the United States and in the UK, whereas for so many people, your only frame of reference is what you saw on television or what you saw in a movie, right? Compare that to the last global pandemic in 1918. I'm sure when they were dealing with influenza, they were dealing with what had previously happened with other outbreaks. Now there were still, from reading accounts, there were still, asshats not wearing masks and stuff in 1918. But I can't help but wonder if sort of viewing reality through the prism of all the pop culture that we've consumed has, for some people, really sort of skewed what reality is. If it helps, I have no idea if this is true or not. If it helps proliferate conspiracy theories, or makes it easier to believe, or make it easier for some people to be like, 4 months of this is enough. This movie's over. I'm done. I don't know what the answer is. But
I think you're right.
I think clearly,
it's a
unique experience.
But also, sort of whatever opinion you have, you can probably find a different outlet that's going to support that. So I guess it's a kind of, as opposed to just having one or two sources of news and this and that. Now it can be like, oh well, I disagree with this news, so I'm going to say it's different, which is in itself terrifying.
I feel like most people in the UK have changed the channel by this point. We're kind of all bored by it, and we've moved on to the next thing.
I thought you meant this.
No.
Ouch.
Which actually quite neatly brings me on to Rob, host, in relation to what Paul was saying, because of course this is like the most immediate movie that can only exist now. That all of the jokes are so current. I mean, I'd love to hear a bit about the journey of that, when you decided to make it and how you did it so very quickly.
Yeah, I mean,
actually, sorry, 1 second, Rob. Quite a lot of people might not have seen it, so would you be able to just very vaguely describe what the film is?
So Host is a horror film that we shot all on Zoom. It's about a bunch of friends who do a weekly Zoom call, and they're bored of doing Netflix parties and quizzes, and so they decide, as you do, to hire a medium and to do an online seance, which goes about as well as you'd expect. And they start getting picked off one by one by a demonic force. And we made it during lockdown. None of us left our houses to make it. We shot it all remotely. We shot it over 12 weeks and released it on Shudder 12 weeks to the day when we came up with the initial idea. And it was basically like all the people that I was hanging out with and doing Netflix parties with and all this kind of stuff. It was basically, I'm a very boring person and I just hang out with people who I work with anyway. So I was hanging out with everyone you need to make a movie. We're on these kind of daily Zoom calls, and it got to a point where we were like, well, we may as well, and I figured if it was rubbish, we'd get a free pass because we made it remotely and, because of the lockdown. And it felt like at the start of lockdown, everyone was kind of sarcastically saying like, oh, who's going to be the first person to make a movie on Zoom? With the heavy inference that that's an awful idea and nobody should do it. And then a couple of months in, nobody had done it. And so we were kind of just like, well, why don't we give it a shot? And
it's awesome.
Yeah.
Getting in there first was a good thing.
Okay. Well, no, but it was nice actually. It was nice going in and having those restrictions and knowing that people would probably assume that we could only do a certain amount in lockdown, and really going in with the intention of like, well, we want to blow their expectations out of the water. We want to see who we can get on board to do a bunch of crazy shit. We want to get stunts and special effects and all this kind of stuff. And we had this kind of realization at the beginning of the process that even though we couldn't be in the same space and that creates a different energy and that's a drawback, there was also the fact that like the whole industry was furloughed. All these amazingly talented people who we wouldn't have been able to afford, who wouldn't have been free to do our movie. Anyone with an internet connection could suddenly help us out. And so basically me and the producer just made this big master list of cool people who we knew who could maybe do things for us, and we just called them up and we were like, what can you do? What are you set up to do? And they were like, oh well, we can make this thing explode, or we can do this crazy stunt. And like we found all these resources and we kind of built the movie backwards from there. I mean, it's kind of the approach that I've always taken on my short films. I mean, I've never had much money to make anything, so it's always been like, well, what are the cool, yeah, like what's the movie I can make right now, rather than waiting around for the ideal scenario to make your dream movie, which will probably never happen. It's like, let's look at the cool things we can do right now that will add production value that maybe people aren't expecting, and let's keep the script elastic and work it around that. So we kind of built Host out that way. And, you know, shooting with people I've collaborated before and with my friends meant that we were already starting from we already had a great working relationship to start with. So we could just figure it out. And it was so much trial and error, and we wouldn't have been able to pull it off if we tried to do it in a conventional way. I mean, it had to be a bunch of friends who all wanted to be there every day, turning up and figuring it out day by day.
Sorry if I missed it, you said how long were you shooting it for?
We did a week's shoot and then about a week of just like dropping in here and there to do like a pickup here and there for some of the effects. But it was 12. The whole thing was 12 from like literally, oh, why don't we do a film on Zoom to it dropping on Shudder was 12 weeks.
I mean, it's amazing. One of the things that you said, Rob, when we spoke last time, is that you very consciously wanted to make a lockdown movie, but not a pandemic movie. Is that sort of indicative of where your sort of head was at? Was that important to you?
Yeah, it felt a bit icky to do a pandemic movie, and we didn't want to touch on any of that stuff. I mean, the idea was to basically make the kind of movie that I wanted to watch in lockdown, you know, to make a really fun, scary as shit roller coaster ride horror movie that was just set in the kind of texture of like, it's such a unique thing that we're basically all living this one shared reality at the moment. And, you know, hopefully we'll never be here again, but you know, we're communicating in the same way. We've got the similar daily routines, and the way that we're communicating is all remotely. And, you know, horror's all about trying to find ideas that people are going to bring home with them and are going to keep, you know, knocking around their head when they're trying to get to sleep at night. And the fact that we're all stuck in our houses and can't get out, it just felt like a great opportunity to do something with that without being too on the nose about it. I think a lot of what people responded to is the characters are in the same situation as them, but it's not about the virus. Pandemic. Yeah, exactly. It's just, it's the backdrop for a film that would otherwise work as a scary kind of fun throwaway horror movie. But you know, when you said it in the lockdown, I think people relate to it so much more deeply.
Yeah. And Paul, of course, you're now working on your new novel. So I'd really love to hear about, well, for a start, how you're sort of able to cope with writing and whether you can concentrate all right, but also whether lockdown has affected the sort of story you want to write.
Yeah. So first, I just want to say, you know, to Rob, when I watched Host, I kind of went to it like not kicking and screaming, but I'm like, all right, like, is it like unended, you know?
Yeah.
But within the first 2 minutes, I was completely won over. Like I was like, oh, okay. Just from like the warmth of the friends, like it really shines through on the screen. I really think that's a part of the reason that so many people have taken to this, because we all do those friends, you know, gathering drinks, you know, doing it that way as opposed to like a work, like people at their job. Like that would have felt like a Saturday Night Live sort of skit or a comedy skit. Whereas this is like, oh, these people are friends. And it was scary because, you know, they were all trying to help each other. I mean, that doesn't happen a lot in all horror movies, but anyway. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of it's all down to how brilliant our cast were, and I got to say, like when you tweeted about Host, we all flipped out. That was we were one of the first people to watch it and tweet about it, and it really meant a lot.
Yeah, now that guy Jed, I can't get rid of him. I'm just kidding. So I'm working on a new novel. I actually sold a new book deal like in July, although it sort of was negotiated in May and like announced in July. So that was kind of weird. Like, I don't know how you guys feel. Like any bit of like good news feels weird to share, even though, I mean, I like hearing good news from people, but just personally, you have that little guilt that something good has happened in such a horrible time. But anyway, I had this idea for a novel. The last two I had written, The Cabin at the End of the World and Survivor Song, are very much about the now, very much about sort of life in Trumplandia in the United States. And so after finishing Survivor Song, I was frankly kind of exhausted about thinking about sort of that kind of stuff. So I'd had this idea. It's called the Pallbearers Club, and it's going to start in the 1980s, and it's going to be sort of written as a faux memoir. And the character is essentially me, but like very much fictionalized, but like a loser teenager in high school. He decides to set up this club called the Pallbearers Club because he needs extracurricular activities to get into college. And so the Pallbearers Club is they volunteer at a local funeral home to serve funerals for homeless and for elderly that don't have a lot of people left in their lives that would show up at the funeral. So it's kind of sweet and nice, but also very weird and morbid. And this older woman sort of joins the club and befriends, you know, the person writing the memoir. and she may or may not be some weird sort of supernatural being. And hopefully the fun part of the book is that it's his memoir, but after every chapter, she writes she writes a rebuttal to his chapters, and will actually make notes in the margins and stuff too. So hopefully that's kind of fun. So it's been hard. I mean, it's gone in waves up and down. Sometimes the writings come okay, but most of the time it's just, the hardest part is dragging myself to the laptop to do it. Like once I'm there, it's actually kind of nice to escape. But for whatever reason, I don't know, it's hard. It's been harder to bring myself to do work. I don't know how it's been for everybody else.
Do you plan it? Do you plan it all out and have the post-its up, or do you have an idea in your head and just write freestyle?
It depends on the book. I mean, to get the book deal, I had to give them like a 10-page summary. So I did. So there was a pretty loose plot outline of what's going to happen. But especially the closer I get to the end, it's sort of like hand wavy, like maybe this will happen. So
something like this, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
How about you?
Every treatment I've ever sold ends with ... Can they survive the night? ...
Wait and see.
Yeah.
Anna and Rose, how about you? How have you found working? Because obviously, Rob, you've been ridiculously productive. But like Anna, you're like putting out podcasts every single week, which is pretty impressive, I think, remotely. And Rose, I know that you're working on various new projects and writing. So how have you found it?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm a massive workaholic, like the unapologetically so, but I think the levels of productivity have completely changed. And I think even for me, what I consider now to be a productive day has also changed, because now if I think back of how I used to work even before this all happened, of just doing days full of meetings and then events in the night and then kind of drinks meetings and things like that, and still producing work like podcasts, like writing, like pieces, like if I'm programming and putting on events or festivals, that involves a whole lot of planning and watching and managing and negotiating and all of that. Now I don't know if this is a work-life balance. It might be, and it just feels foreign to me. And what I was doing before was sick. But what I'm feeling now is that actually I focus a lot more on the thing at hand, and I spread out the work a lot more. But it does mean that actually I do feel productive, but almost guilty at all times, because I'm not producing as much as I would before lockdown, because the conditions are different. You can't do the same things. Obviously, a lot of my work is involved in live events and working with cinemas and working in exhibition. That's all completely transformed, nay, I think forever, which on the one hand, I kind of went through a period of mourning of, is this the end of cinema? Is this the end of film festivals as I've known them? Is this the end of programming as I've trained and learned to do it? And then kind of once that was over, I started looking at it kind of in a macro way. How this has entirely changed our relationship to exhibition and to the cinema experience, which is one of the things that I love the most and one of the big areas of my work. So now I'm just looking and fascinated with how people are adapting. And by people, I mean the industry, festivals, exhibitors, programmers, but also audiences. You know, I'm both of those. I'm constantly going to things and watching things at the same time as putting them on. So I think that's definitely changed. It's been a much more reflective period in that sense. And that's also allowed me a lot of time to just actually produce work like podcasts, like writing, and you sort of navigate around it and you try to make it work remotely in whatever ways possible. Frankly, might never go back to doing physical interviews because this is just so much comfier.
Yeah, and I know that you had to, Anna, unfortunately, cancel or postpone Underwire this year.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I was talking about this the other day, and I feel like it was the right decision, because one of the, you know, Rose mentioned before kind of having friends who are premiering their films digitally now, and that kind of being a blow or disappointment for filmmakers. And I very much had that in mind, because one of the big things about a festival that's designed for platforming emerging talent is the community, is the fact of seeing your film on a big screen, is the fact of being able to see people watching it, meet people, put a face to a name. It's specifically focused on female talent. And it's specifically focused on female talent across the craft. So it's not just directors and not just performers, which means that it's very, very important to see them in person. It's very important to see them speak and hear them speak. If I'm not able to offer that, I would feel like I would be shortchanging filmmakers and audiences. It would mean that I would be taking their submissions money and not giving them the experience and the opportunities that I promised them as part of the festival, which I'm just not ethically and comfortable with doing in any way, shape, or form. So I pulled the plug on Underwire very quickly into the pandemic situation in late March. And part of the reason for doing that was that. And another big part of it was because I knew that I could refund everyone if I pulled the plug at that point, which was also extremely important. It just meant that I could give back the money that, especially up-and-coming filmmakers, submissions cost a lot of money. Submitting your film to festivals is a whole process, especially if you're not at a feature film level and you've got sales agents, distributors, or agents to support you in that and to negotiate behind the scenes. So I would feel I don't think I could sleep at night knowing that I take submissions money from aspiring filmmakers and not deliver them an experience.
No, short films makers just be, the directors just usually probably forking out their own money and kind of sending it off. I had one of my shorts shown at Underwire. I just remembered ages ago, and it was so great. And then there was sort of like networking thing afterwards, and I did a short film called Stormhouse, and our sound designer Claudia Casola, we won like a best sound design thing, and then she got set up with like a mentor, I think, and stuff. So it was really, really great. I guess shorts and stuff particularly is tricky because it often is like the film, probably the same like shorts, like I don't know, the amount of time and money you end up just filling out forms and sending off DVDs.
So much money. Yeah,
totally.
You're like, Jesus. When would it have been again? Underwire? I forgot whenabouts in the year it is.
It would have been next week. It would have been next week across 10 days. So I'm still gonna get drunk for 10 days next week, but it'll just be me as opposed to with lovely filmmakers.
It would be rude not to.
Exactly.
So on that, Rose, I mean, your movie, like I said, I was lucky enough to see it, and it's absolutely extraordinary. It's just like when I know some of the people watching will have already seen it because it screened Glasgow, but a lot of people won't have done. But when it lands, it's going to be as explosive as any of the biggest horror movies of the year. And I know that you did get to do the festival circuit, which I'm very happy for you. But I wondered whether you've sort of felt like you've, missed out a bit on that early surge, and also whether, if you wouldn't mind, can you tell without spoilers a little bit about the film and a little bit about the sort of making of St. Maud?
So it's a psychological horror film called St. Maud, and it's about this young woman who's a live-in nurse, like a live-in carer, and she goes to move in with her newest patient, Amanda, who's this retired dancer who's a bit sort of fabulous and scary, who's dying. And Maud's a really, really devout Christian, and she's got kind of a quite weird very intense, unusual relationship with God, and she sort of thinks that she's in direct communication with him and that he's sort of sending her secret signs and instructions. And she gets it into her head that she's been sent to this new patient, Amanda, to save her soul before she dies, because she's like a heathen. And so she kind of embarks on that mission. Everything sort of goes a bit wrong. And I'm still never sure if that's actually a good synopsis or description, but and we shot it we've finished it sort of this kind of time last year, I think. So to be honest, like it's all been the last 2 years for me anyway, making the film, and everything felt really surreal. So in a way, then it was like, great, pandemic, I was like, fine, okay, that sounds about right. So we finished it this time last year, did the festival run, and it was going to be coming out in cinemas in America and the UK sort of around April, May this year. So like I said, we were literally just about to get on a plane and go and do all of the sort of swanky press kind of stuff, which isn't happening now probably. To be honest, I don't feel like sure in the beginning there was certainly a week or two when everything was really uncertain and it was like, are we going, aren't we, is it going to be released, isn't it? There was like definitely a stressful sort of couple of weeks, and like I was sort of disappointed at first, but to be honest, like I think I've been really lucky with the timing. Like I said, we just managed to enjoy all of the actual physical festival run. We're still getting a release. I'm in quite a sort of lucky, privileged position with it, really. So I'm kind of just sort of counting my blessings, to be honest. And I don't know. We'll see. I mean, it certainly puts things in perspective, because like when you're sort of making your film, it's like, this is the most important thing in the world, and yet so stressed about it. And then it's kind of like, global disaster.
Have you been able to work okay?
So cool.
Oh man,
So cool.
that's so cool. Amazing.
I finally
it's been lovely.
I put off reading this article because I wanted to see the movie first. Just to interrupt really quickly, say it's a brilliant movie. As Rob said, it's just a beautiful, gorgeously shot movie. I was inspired. For me, it was like one of those movies that I wish I wrote. Like I told you, it had some vibes, or it reminded me of how much I love Take Shelter. Like, even though they're very different films, like the ambiguity and the stuff that's going on is like, I wish I wrote that. It was like, okay, I have to do something good now because Saint Maud is so good. Anyway, sorry.
Oh, thanks, Brad. Take that. That's a very flattering comparison. I love Take Shelter. It's it's been weird and fun, and to be honest, I think in terms of like writing and working in lockdown, like I think in the beginning, but like because it's been sort of quite an intense, weird couple of years, like great, but in a way, having an enforced bit of downtime to just stop and do nothing was quite nice. And I'm a bit of a hermit anyway, so it wasn't too bad. And like I lived with sort of nice housemates and cats and garden and stuff. So I actually sort of at the beginning was like, okay, I'm not going to do any work, at least for the foreseeable, for now, because at that point we obviously had no idea when it would end. It was just kind of, I'm just going to, in a way we're all sort of like, living through history. So like friends who were kind of like worrying, I think I had a few days where I was like, I should be productive. But I don't know, friends who were stressing out. I was like, you're just existing now that's all you sort of need to do. Like it's who knows what's happening. But then weirdly, I found that we lost Rob, by the way. Oh no, he's back.
Sorry, my computer crashed. Sorry.
Ghosts for sure.
Always ghosts.
Yeah, but I think because I'd sort of switched my brain off and sort of decided I wouldn't be doing any work, I then, after a little while, just ended up naturally starting to write stuff just because I sort of wanted to. And that's a much nicer way to do it. It's like, you're actually it was in a nice position of finding myself writing something because I wanted to be writing it. And because I find it interesting, rather than being like, I should be doing this. So I wrote it like a snail's pace, and so I did a first draft of something. It's not very good, but it was, actually ended up being more productive than I thought. So,
can you tell us anything about it? Is it horror?
This one, I've sort of got a couple of things ago. The one that I wrote in lockdown, sort of, it's kind of body horror esque-ish.
Yeah.
And I guess the main character is quite sort of isolated, claustrophobic sort of thing. It was an idea that I come up with before lockdown, but then the mood of it seemed to fit quite well. But I was definitely watching some pretty weird research films, but I won't say anymore. And then after that, I think when real life started to sort of like swing into gear a little bit more, then I sort of started going back to the office and I'm co-writing a thing with a friend there. So then enforced a little bit more structure. So that's another one which isn't a horror, more of like a kind of fucked up sort of romance crime thing. I don't know. Never sure. Like, I'm just like, I can't say anything. It's like, who cares? Like, but I'll keep it mysterious.
Keep it mysterious. So like Anna, you were talking about networking, but Rob, I saw just today a picture of you on a Zoom call with Sam Raimi. Like you seem to have kind of nailed the networking from lockdown.
Well, that was something we've actually been working with Sam on that project for the last year, but it's just one of these weird things where you don't know what you can announce and what you can say, and and it felt like with all the kind of the heat behind Host, it was a good time to announce that, and it's it's just about ready to go out to the town, and we've got a great script for it. But it's been really fun being able to do Host after having worked with Sam, because I feel like I've learned so much as a storyteller from Sam that actually made its way into Host. I feel like if I hadn't have known Sam this last year, Host would have been a very different movie. He's very much, the questions he's always asking when we're doing our script meetings, it's what's the experience the audience is having right now? What's this? How do you want the audience to feel in this scene? And just really kind of interrogating every decision, and not, I think as a director, sometimes you can just get a bit wanky and just be doing things that only you will care about. But actually having the audience at the forefront of your mind is such a great way of it's a great kind of great process to work through. And I think we did that on Host. So I think a large part of why Host works is down to what we've learned from Sam.
And I also saw that you have been greenlit for this Ghost in a Prison horror.
Yeah.
Is that going to be a socially distanced, like, are you planning how you might do it if things don't go back to normal?
Yeah, I think we're always keeping that in the back of our mind. I mean, the good thing about horror is generally is better with less people in a contained environment anyway. Like those are the kind of horror movies that I tend to want to make. You know, the more claustrophobic, the better. The less characters, the better. So, you know, obviously that one's a prison, so you've got quite a lot of characters, but it is one location. So I don't quite know how that works, but it certainly looks filmable if the world's still on fire next year. And the Sam Raimi one is pretty much single location. So I think that we'd be fine to do that under COVID restrictions. But we kind of haven't got to the point where we've had to bend the projects to the restrictions yet, which is good. They just naturally fit there.
Rosie, if I can just add something, one of the things that I found so fascinating about Host and actually Saint Maud, which I was lucky enough to see it at a big screen at LFF last year, and I remember almost having to fight for a ticket. Like, it very quickly became one of those films at a film festival environment that everybody is like, we need to see it. I need to get in. I don't care. Who do I call? Who do I schmooze? What do I need to do to get a ticket? Like, it needs to be seen. And it's this kind of intense, again, kind of communal experience of everybody just kind of fighting to go see a film, which is what you want, I guess, as a filmmaker. And with Host, it's been what, a month since it premiered on Shudder?
A month today.
It's just been insane with everybody watching it. A month today. Oh, happy month anniversary of your horror, baby. But it's this incredible sort of contagious effect of everybody, and not just horror fans, totally tuning in and getting a film, and it's spreading beyond, say, the horror crowd, beyond the film crowd, beyond the cinephiles, beyond the festivals, or what we used to know as the cinema experience. Now it's just in the zeitgeist. And it's the last time I remember that happening really vividly was with Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, where suddenly it completely transcended everything. People who'd never watched a foreign language film, people who'd never watched a Bong Joon-ho film, people who'd never seen a Korean film were just obsessed and into Parasite. So it's just been incredible culturally, I think, to watch it happen. And the fact that it's all kind of unfolded online has been extraordinary.
That's a brilliant point, Anna. I love that, and I think that's so true and so fascinating. And actually, from a perspective of a horror fan and journo, it's absolutely brilliant to see two of the most exciting movies of the year to be genre movies, and very different genre movies, but still very definitely horror. And I think that's just super exciting. I mean, I guess I'd ask all of you if you have any sort of thoughts about what the impact of this might be on horror and the genre going forward.
Oh yes, that's what we're talking about. I don't know. I'm kind of into mine. I mean, because you can sort of watch it. You can find anything you want to watch now because there's so many different outlets for it. It's not. I don't know. I mean, the horror geeks are always going to seek out horror, and I'm sure that's it. But in terms of like whether it sort of goes more and how affects like mainstream audiences. I mean, part of me was wondering going to be sort of like, you know, sort of Great Depression, where suddenly it was like, musicals, Hollywood, don't think about real life, kind of escape. So I don't know, maybe it's not what you guys, maybe not the right thing to say, but in a way I'm kind of thinking horror seems to be having a bit of a surge, or had a bit of a surge. If anything, in the not too distant future, are people going to be, is there going to be like loads of musicals and comedies again, or sort of escaping? Like, are people going to want to be reminded of the horrible things in life, or is it going to be about sort of closing your eyes to it for a bit?
I feel like horror movies give you a chance to funnel all that real world horror into a bite-sized little scream of angst that you can do abstract. You can be done with it in 80 minutes, and then you can kind of feel a bit better on the other side. So I don't know. I feel like when I'm stressed out, I want to watch more horror rather than less. I don't know. Yeah,
personally, I agree. I guess I'm just wondering how if we're just weirdos. So
I think we probably are, yeah.
But there's there's definitely something about.
I mean, do you know what?
Feeling something. Sorry. You go.
I think if this is my connection is really weird, so sometimes I feel like I'm interjecting at the wrong time. But I think we are all weirdos, but I think if anything, this period has shown us that everybody's a little bit weird. And if this means a renaissance of the weird going forward, then I am completely here for it. So. I cannot wait to see it. I would like more horror films, more weird comedies, more weird rom-coms. Just make everything a tiny bit more sci-fi, a tiny bit weirder. And it kind of taps in, I think, to a general upheaval of our, I don't know, cultural palette, I guess. I think people are kind of embracing the things that they genuinely enjoy a bit more. The idea of the guilty pleasure, I think, is completely decimated after lockdown. There's just no time for that. What's the point of feeling guilty about the things that you enjoy if literally the entire world is burning around you?
That's very true.
I would only add, 'cause I have no idea like what type of stories, but I would only add, and I think when Anna brought up, Parasite, we're already seeing it, is the acceptance and celebration of more sort of own voices in horror, both in film and books. I mean, you're seeing it this summer too, with in the United States, Silvia Moreno Garcia's Mexican Gothic has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 5 weeks in a row now, I think. And Stephen Graham Jones's novel, The Only Good Indians, has been such a huge hit. So, I'm hopeful that we're going to continue to see more acceptance of not just guys who look like me writing books.
Well, actually, I think that's a really good point, Paul. And again, a question for all of you. Do you think this might help diversify the genre a little bit? Because people, like Rob, you made your movie with very little money. I mean, I know, Rose, yours wasn't massive budget either, but if there are lots of people who are sort of sitting around and maybe they do have time to write something, or maybe they do have, I don't know, the space to make a little short horror. Do you think that could be a positive that comes from this?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean,
Sorry, go on.
Maud's definitely the slightly more trad sort of route, but I think hopefully things like Host, that would certainly, if I'd seen that, if I'd been a teenager in lockdown and sort of watching that would sort of be pretty inspiring. If sort of just be creative with what's around you. I hope so.
I think it's nice because nobody knows what this situation is going to look like going forward, and nobody knows how to. We're all figuring it out. So if you can get ahead and you can say, oh, I've done something with this scenario that nobody else figured out. We're the first ones there. It gives you a little bit of leverage. I mean, we've had just the interest that we've had post the film coming out has been amazing, because it feels like we've kind of unlocked a methodology of making things for a low budget and having them connect. And I think if filmmakers can get ahead and figure out a way to turn these restrictions into an advantage, if people can you can't have more than X amount of people in a room. Well, I've got a horror movie that I wrote during lockdown it's a really fucking great script and it's just 2 people in a room like that. Maybe there's a way of leveraging the situation to get those more interesting, smaller movies out there. And to fill the void that's currently there because people aren't going to see the big studio releases.
Well, yeah, it's particularly the process of sort of traditional films of sort of the gap between sort of making things and then promoting it and sort of coming out into the cinemas. It's all quite sort of slow and big, and filmmakers being flown around the world to do Q&As and stuff, and it's not necessary. I mean, sometimes it's fun to anyway, but it's, I don't know.
People just want content now.
Yeah, I think it's pressure on sort of. I hate to say content creators, writers, directors, whatever, to be a bit more nimble and imaginative, I guess.
I'm going to open up the floor to some questions. We've had some questions through, so I'm going to, if anybody else wants to ask any questions, then now is the time to do it. But I'm going to, so this is actually a pretty similar point actually to what you were just making, Rose, but just to clarify. So this question comes from Alex Secker, and he says, do you think the shift towards video on demand, thanks to coronavirus, sees studios focus their attention more on mid and lower budget projects as opposed to massive record-breaking blockbusters?
Sorry. Hiccup. I don't know. I mean, part of me thinks that maybe the sort of big films that actually come out in the cinema will lean more and more to sort of going to the cinema being more of a kind of spectacle, slightly rarer occurrence, only for the sort of really big, the need to see if it's low level budget kind of dramas and smaller films that kind of maybe do work just fine watching at home. Then maybe.
I've got a fun fact for you, by the way.
I think
the box office Tenet's come in, and it took 53 million on its opening weekend. Bearing in mind it hasn't opened in the States, it's quite promising. It's pretty good.
Wow.
I think it's a really interesting and also very strange and potentially either great or not so great situation. Obviously, I'm completely speculating, so this could be interpreted as utter shit, what I'm about to say. But this is what I'm thinking. it's interesting to me that I see the films that were completely pushed back by a year, like the Fast and the Furious film and Bond and a few others, where the majority of their box office money is basically from theatrical, and it's from international box office, so not just say domestic, and by domestic I mean the US box office. And the decision process is obviously, I could imagine, incredibly complicated, but you can see that the principle behind it is that the majority of the money is going to come from a theatrical experience. It needs to exist and be put in cinemas to make back the budget and the marketing budget as well. But then I do worry, because in my heart, I really wish that this means that there will be more money spread out on low budget and mid budget movies, and just have more interesting creators, instead of having to pressure a filmmaker with a $150 million franchise, give 10 filmmakers kind of a smaller pots of money and let them make a film, and then release it at kind of a lower risk, which some people like Blumhouse have done incredibly successfully already, and have proven that that's a model that works, and you can test out filmmakers as well. But I do worry that might mean that if, say, we never really truly recover the cinematic experience as we've known it so far for over 100 years, that maybe that means that the studios or the distributors, in order to avoid risk, just kind of make the cinema experience a luxury experience, so devoted entirely to those films that can make money in a theatrical space, like Rose was saying. And that makes me worry, because I want to see films like Simon. I want to see films like, I don't know, Marriage Story, which is, a kind of a high budget for what it is. It's a divorce drama, but I want to see dramas and small indie movies and low budget movies in a cinema as well. And I'm worried that perhaps the changing landscape might mean that there's less opportunities for them outside of a festival circuit to actually be released theatrically. So, I mean, obviously this is all speculative, but I can see that might be, it's already an avenue that the exhibition sector has kind of been going into, selling the cinema experience as a lux experience, as opposed to a really accessible, and that's a worrying trend, I think, especially for mid to low budget movies.
I've got a nice question here from Vincent Gain, who says, horror often engages with topical issues, and Corona will likely be no exception. What issues, other than the obvious infection, do you imagine future horror films will be exploring?
Which come up out of the pandemic?
I think fear of other people. I mean, whenever I go out to the shop, it feels like, it follows. You're walking down the street and you see somebody at a distance. You're like, oh, do I cross the road? Are they going to come near me? I feel like that's going to be the thing. The fear of other people, and fear of leaving your house. I think that's the next one. I don't think anyone's going to want pandemic infection movies. I feel like that's it's too on the nose.
And conversely, I guess, alongside the fear of other people is also, I guess, the fear of isolation, or just
loneliness,
losing exactly, and sort of losing your mind in confined spaces, maybe more. And again, I've made a film which is about mental health, so maybe that's why I bang on about that kind of thing. But obviously, alongside the pandemic and lockdown, like sort of people grappling with mental health and those sort of issues and needing help in that regard is kind of soared. So maybe that's something that, particularly in horror, I don't know, sometimes the scariest place to be is your own brain. So maybe that.
I'd also say, I think you're just going to see a lot of like subtle ways where it sort of creeps into whatever story you're doing. I mean, I'm already noticing it now in this book where I'm in 1988, 1989, nothing to do with now, but I'm writing parts of it and like, so in my head, I'm like, someone's going to read that and realize, that's
different context, because
this is where I am now. Right. So I think it'll be a lot of subtle ways too. Just the fear of disconnection as well as the fear of others. The fear of like, sort of what we're doing now, we don't get to hang out in person, and like, what that does to relationships and your own mental health, obviously.
Well, that's so kind of spinning off from that, Paul. I have a question specifically for you from Matt Glasby, and he says, how does the horror of hope survive a pandemic? Just contextually for the rest of you, the horror of hope is kind of a Paul Tremblay thing. And he says, how does that... You're the worst.
So I don't know, I guess semi-obnoxiously, and I did not create this. I mean, I think I remember John Clute, wonderful British writer and critic, talk about horror. I don't know. So I like to boil like, a horror story or really any sort of movie, book, film. It doesn't even have to be horror. Is you're communicating a reveal of a truth, right? In a horror story, it's the reveal of a terrible truth. But I find even in the most bleak stuff, and I've been accused of being pretty bleak in my writing, I find hope in the reveal of that truth, because there is hope in the shared recognition that something is terribly wrong. And even if we don't survive, even if, the characters don't survive or don't make it through, and they're certainly not going to make it through unscathed, I don't know, I find a little bit of hope in that recognition. So that part hasn't changed. I mean, I don't know, like if the hope of, my hope for society and everything else, that changes like by the nanosecond, but in terms of the horror story framework, it really hasn't changed for me.
I have another question, and this is for all of you. I think this is a great one. This is from Josh Winning, and he says, will storytellers now be expected to reference COVID in their contemporary stories? So like Rose, for example, if you'd made St. Maud now, would you feel like you had to make it in a post-COVID world?
I don't know. I mean, maybe like the character used to be a nurse and work in a hospital and stuff, and she spends a lot of time isolated. So in some ways, there's some maybe I've pushed. I don't know though. Like writing, like I don't that you guys writing in lockdown. I obviously like had moments where it's like, I maybe this could be set in lockdown as well, and then that adds another layer of blah blah blah. And in a way, I kind of feel, but then I started thinking about all the screenwriters locked up around the world writing pandemic scripts and things that are set in lockdown, and was like, is this just going to be like, in a way, that's why I'm saying, like, I think host, the fact that like you sort of now it's like a sort of a new thing and it's come out like while it's happening and it feels sort of fresh is great, because I wouldn't be surprised if there's like a whole slew of like similar things that come out later. And I don't know, part of it, it's weird. It'll be a balance between, in some senses, it could feel gimmicky or too much too soon, or people being like, this is topical. But I mean, at some point, this is just going to be a part of history, and this is just going to be what the world looked like at this time. People wear masks. It's just sort of a new normal. So I'm kind of interested to see how it's going to affect different genres and actually sort of films which otherwise aren't at all about the pandemic or COVID. So like, how's like a kitchen sink domestic drama sort of in a house that happens to be during lockdown? There's sort of some quite, I don't know, very waffly answer, but
no, I think that's really fascinating.
It's going to be weird. I'm sure everyone's going to try, and some of it's going to be, we'll probably be sick of it at a certain point. Pandemic.
A lot of it, so much of it's going to be awful, I'm sure. But I think, I think what's really interesting is just taking the texture of our day-to-day lives, and I think that's what's going to be. I think you're going to have to work that in some way. I think you couldn't have a script that begins with two characters, meeting at a train station and hugging, because the audience, if that was to come out in 6 months, the audiences would be like, "Oh, that makes me feel weird." Bodily contact.
Yeah, at a certain point, it'll just be accurate for setting something in a present day story. You'll need to address it in some way.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I've been quite fascinated. Well, actually, a very close friend of mine has made me quite fascinated about the world of soap operas and how they've dealt with it. Because Rose, like you were saying, not horror stories, but you can't have a modern soap where this hasn't happened, because otherwise you just lose connection with it. I think that's a very interesting.
And that's quite interesting, because then even soap operas, you'll have people, characters sort of suddenly, maybe dealing with more existential kind of stuff. It makes people think about things they might not have normally done. So I don't know.
Yeah. But I think it will enter into movies the same way it's entered into our real lives. Like I went to visit my nan for the first time yesterday. I'm back home at the moment, and I was sitting around with my extended family, and we were talking about lockdown and death rates and all this. And it's just, I had this weird like out of body moment where I'm like, what's going on? Like my nan is talking about like all these, just how, I mean, like Rosie, you were saying at the beginning, how fast it's become normal. That's what's really scary. And I'm sure it will become normalized in cinema as well.
To be honest with grandparents, I just keep thinking, sorry, you go.
I was just saying, at the risk of the minorest of spoilers for Rob's movie, I think, it's not a pandemic movie. They're on a Zoom call, but at some point there's a character who goes outside and has a mask on, and then that's I mean, that's the only. I find it powerful. Not only as a nod to what's going on, but I don't know, just again building the character, trying to help people too, which is again one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to that movie. Through everything, no matter how bad stuff gets, they're still trying to help each other.
Yeah, and also a bit of a spoiler, but there's a really good joke about somebody covering a cough with a fart as opposed to the other way around, which is hilarious now and probably won't be in 2 years' time. But I love the The currentness of it. Okay, so I have a question from Sophie Barkley, which is very interesting. And she asks, when you spoke about the collective viewing experience of the horror film in the cinema, do you think there is a way for the online world to emulate that? And has it for Host?
Well, Host is in, like, you know, one of our big references for Host was this movie Ghost Watch from 1992, which, like, we were always trying to figure out a way to make people forget that they were watching the movie. And I don't like Ghost Watch. They trick people into thinking they were seeing a live seance on TV, and all the craziness that ensued was real, and people panicked and called in the BBC. And me and Jed have been trying to figure out a way of doing something like that for ages, but I don't think there is a way now with the internet that you could do that. But a really gratifying thing is people saying, you know, I was watching Host and I forgot that I wasn't on the Zoom meeting. You know, when the pop-up comes up, I move my mouse to try and click it away.
Yeah.
And I think there's a level of there's a level of engagement that's really fun. And people have been, because it's a film set on Zoom and it's a very current film, and people, you know, so people are having Zoom. They've got one screen with their friends on Zoom while they watch the movie who set on Zoom on their laptop. So it's very specific thing for Host. I don't know if that would work. For other movies. I mean, I've been doing Netflix parties almost every day with my friends, but that's just it's mostly Patrick Swayze movies, and we take the piss out of them. It's like it's not the same experience of all being in the same moment. It's quite detached, I think, when you're having to go screen to screen.
Yeah, maybe in terms of like the collective viewing experience and how it adapts to sort of being online here. Like I heard some. Like a couple of friends who are really into like a lot of these like immersive theatre productions, Punch Drunk things, whatever, where you go and sort of go to different rooms and you talk with the actors, and how I think there's been a few of them who've quite successfully transferred to being online during lockdown. Like I can't remember the name, but there's one in New York my friend was describing, and like you do it on Zoom, you like buy a ticket and then there's different rooms that you can go into, and each room's a different Zoom conversation with actors doing a performance, and so but you can see all the other windows of everyone else in the room watching, which sounds fucking crazy.
Wow.
But apparently it's brilliant. So yeah, maybe there'll be more stuff like that, which sounds really weird to us now, but in the future it'll be.
Well, yeah, I was watching one. I think I was telling you about it before, Rose, but like there's this Australian one called In the Shadow It Waits, or In the Shadows It Waits, which is like a live performance, but it's filmed. So you buy a ticket and you watch it, and there's like something like, I don't know, 58 camera setups and 61 angles, but it is all being done live. So they're performing it in different states in Australia. So it's a cross between film and theatre, and it's just really fascinating. So I think, I hope you're right. I hope that sort of innovative stuff does.
Does it work? Is it involved? Does it play like a movie?
It does play like a movie. I think you'd really like it, Rob. It has some similarities to Host. It does start with a Zoom call, but it then becomes something else.
Yeah.
It's very clever. I mean, I'll put you in touch with the guy. Like, I think you're.
Yeah, could you? That sounds wicked.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I think we've probably got time for one more, maybe, or two possibly. Okay, so Ryan Holloway asks, do you think horror will go more retro so that people can go back to safer and more comforting times?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think yes, but the idea of safety and comfort is a really interesting one, because when I was mentioning before kind of not being able to focus on new stuff, on new movies, and going back and just rewatching, like I found myself spending hours rewatching things that I'd seen a million times. And there's an element there of comfort, of knowing what's going to happen, because one of the kind of unbearable things about this whole situation is that there is no end in sight. Even when we're told that something, when lockdown ended, it's not really finished. Which means that it's kind of the horror movie that will never stop. Like, it keeps going. So the idea of going back in time, or even setting something in the past, like Paul was talking about his new book being set in the 80s. I find that all of those feelings are interconnected, kind of the rewatching and not being able to focus on new stuff, because the uncertainty of fiction is too much to handle, combined with the uncertainty of real life that we're surrounded by endlessly, constantly. And there's a thing that a friend of mine who's a screenwriter mentioned to me a while back as we were in lockdown and she was working on her new script, is the idea that anything that's written now, or anything that she might be writing or working on kind of set in the present or the immediate future, is by default science fiction, because we don't know what's happening. We don't know what's going to happen. So it's almost impossible, or she was finding it really difficult to kind of wrap her head around how do I present people just interacting? How are people going to behave? Because all of those things are now manifesting organically, and Host kind of captures a lot of things that were so relatable in the moment in lockdown, from the way that people react to your hair because nobody was been to a hairdresser in like 5 or 6 months, or the mask or the elbow bump, things like that become normal so quickly, and we adapt really quickly. Even Zoom. I didn't know what Zoom was until lockdown happened.
Yeah.
Like, when did that substitute Skype, right? So we all of these kind of cultural upheavals are very unpredictable. But going back to the original question, which I find is interesting, I think we're gonna kind of sink a little bit deeper into nostalgia, and there's a whole theory about the nostalgia cycle being sort of 30 years. So we're now kind of living in the 90s, peak 90s nostalgia, which, you know, I'm thoroughly enjoying. But at the same time, I think we just need to be able to understand what sort of world we're living in, and until we kind of make our peace and understand what this new normal is, and I kind of hate that expression now, and what the immediate future looks like, it's the only place where we can actually set anything happening. So I can fully expect a wave of retro horror or horror set up until the moment where this happened.
Yeah. Okay, we're basically out of time. Here's a question that's not really a question, that comes from the evolution of horror, and they ask. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, I can never find anything when I'm looking for it. Oh yeah, is this really a panel or a secret backdoor sequel to Host?
My candle's out. Oh no.
Oh no, you're going to be the first to go, Paul.
Oh
Sorry.
no, Paul.
Them's the rules.
Oh, my light's gone.
Oh. Okay, well, I think we've run out of time, but you guys are amazing. So at home, massive thanks to Anna Bogetskaya, Rose Glass, Rob Savage, and Paul Tremblay.
Thanks so much, Rosie.
Thank you so much, Rosie.
Bye.
You're amazing.
Bye. Happy spookies.
Happy spookies.
Happy spookies.